Alright YouTube, it's time for the Occult, video 116, the concepts of Ascendance and Descendance. Literally up into the sky or in a more mystical, sort of spiritual way, and then down into the earth, again, physically, more or less physical. These topics, these concepts for early man must have made perhaps a little bit more sense than today. Of course now, we've sent things up into space. We fly regularly. It's mundane at this point. There was a time when it was exciting and new. Now it's, oh yeah, I'm going to Jamaica. I'm gonna hop on a flight. I'll pay a few $100s. That's all you do. Oh yeah, the clouds are pretty outside the window. Seeing them from the top is pretty novel. The first time you fly, if you've ever been on an airplane, is probably quite exciting for you. It certainly was for me. I was up there, I was like, whoa, everything's trippy. Then, the third or fourth time, it's like, yeah, I'm flying. It's pretty interesting. I'm floating around up here. Of course, we now know as well, on the other side, for descent, parsley's roots do not grow to hell. There is no actual subterranean sort of cavern in the earth where the dead go to suffer in purgatory or anything like that. But to earlier man, these things actually made literal sense. The church literally taught many centuries ago that hell was a literally subterranean location. Heaven was literally up in the sky, as in out in the cosmos above Earth. It was not ethereal. It wasn't a spiritual location as is generally taught now. In fact, that is not even a biblical perspective. The biblical perspective is that you're literally talking about up in the clouds, up in the stars. You're literally talking about below the earth when you're talking about hell. The very word, the very concept of Sheol is literally down in the earth, literally in the grave. To early man, once he began burying his dead, it made sense that subterranean locations would have something to do with death. Either the caves they were mummifying people in, the ground that they buried them in, and so forth. We can go back literally many thousands of years to the Neanderthals, and they were already burying people. We're still not sure if it was truly ritualized. We know that they buried people with certain personal implements. The idea of flower offerings hasn't exactly been proven. That may have been added later. Maybe by some ancient group they stumbled upon these remains, put flowers there, figuring it was a recent burial or something. So it's not entirely clear. We're not sure it was fully ritualized. But we do know there was a burial of the dead. And we know that in many ancient cultures, you look at Egyptians especially, they had the literal concept of ascent, literally the soul, some essence of the person traveling upwards into the stars. The pharaohs believed that they would become a star, and that those stars out there were literally like gods. They were deities of some sort or another. Over time, as we began exploring the caves and exploring the deep ocean and using, seismometers and so forth, we realized there was no hell down in the earth. We realize that indeed it's largely just a giant ball of magma over which there's some crust and then some semi-dried mantle. Certainly there are a lot of caves, a lot of cavern systems, but there's no actual hell beneath our feet. We look up in the sky, we start flying around in the clouds, we don't find heaven up there. My goodness, well, what fucking happened? We start shooting the moon, literally, so to speak. No heaven up there either. There's just a moon. There's, the atmosphere, and then there's above the atmosphere. There's empty space. We send probes out into deep space. Some of them are out there now. We've explored all these various planets. We've done a flyby of Pluto, and we still haven't found heaven. Now, if you had told somebody 1,000 years ago that would happen, they would have probably burned you as a heretic, because they would have said, of course heaven's up there above the clouds somewhere. Or on some really high mountain peak in some far-off utopian golden land, sort of like the Atlantean stuff. They would have said, of course hell is down in the ground. That's where the devil is. Now, the problem in the Christian tradition, of course, is that they're mixing up Tartarus with hell. They're mixing up the Greek sort of pantheistic system and its statements about Hades and things like that with their actual Bible. That's where that imagery comes from. Consult your Bible sometime and see what actual words are used for this mythical land of hell that they speak of you'll find it's a little bit different. I've already treated on this subject, spoken of Gehenna, the burning place, literally just sort of an ever-burning trash pile outside of Jerusalem. That's literally what it was. The metaphor here, of course, is that the souls of the sinner, the souls of somebody who has lived an unjust life, is like unto being burned forever in Gehenna. That doesn't actually mean that they were imagining a subterranean location that was literally like when you watch some, atomic or, Edwardian era treatment of what hell is. It's a cave full of stalactites and little red men with pitchforks and there's fire everywhere. All of that is Hades imagery. The pitchfork comes from Hades, from Pluto. The fire comes from Tartarus. It comes from the idea of being like purged or something before some other afterlife, and sort of the river Styx and so forth. Dante mixes up all this stuff. That's where that imagery comes from. The idea of heaven up literally in the clouds. Unless you're consulting Revelation and talking about a giant golden cube coming down to rest on an exceedingly high mountain and you're taking Revelation literally, there's no statement about that as a physical place either. But that was what was taught by Christian theology for over 1,000 years. That's what they taught. They said heaven is literally out there in the clouds, up there in the stars. They envisioned that all of that stuff was held up in some way. They didn't understand the concept of heliocentrism fully. There were people at the time, by the way, and admittedly so, because the ancient Greeks thought this up. They knew the world was round. They had an idea that it might orbit around the sun, but the church didn't accept that because it happened to not have been something that the Jews ever thought was true. They had an earth-centric sort of model in mind. As a result, when Christianity developed out of it, they kept that general model and killed anybody who didn't agree with them, regardless of how intelligent they were. So the idea in the spiritual sense of ascent and descent, as most people envision it within the West, of going to a heaven, going to a hell, either suffering or being in paradise, it is largely based on the misunderstanding of some pagan systems long, long ago that dealt with a literal subterranean or sort of cosmic location that you went when you died. Elysium, of course, is not really up there in the stars, but Olympus is. Olympus is certainly Valhalla, literally connected by the sort of Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge to Valhalla, up there in the high mountains. You have these pagan systems quite clearly and literally stating this. These are, physical places within these pagan systems. Christendom, though, didn't have these things. It had vague statements from Judaism about this Sheol place, which is literally the grave, about the metaphor of Gehenna, which is where you get the burning. They dragged in some Greek material, and that's how you get hell. The concept of paradise, the concept of wisdom and so forth, is really more part of the Jewish mystic tradition than any actual Orthodox rendition of many of their scriptures. Indeed, the very concept of an afterlife doesn't even develop until quite a bit later. Until then, this is sort of a sad little religion that believes that people just sort of stop existing when they die unless God happens to make them immortal before that happens, like Enoch or something like that. It's actually very, very interesting to study the interplay, how these religions and these spiritual forces influenced one another over time. Because most people in the West are Christians, Muslims, or Jews. Most people. In fact, most people in this world fit into one of those three groups. And they believe fundamentally similar things about the basic concept of paradise or hell, of ascent or descent. Basically, they use different names for the deities that they worship. They use different names for the locations. They use different names for sort of the attendant evil or good spirits or whatever that happen to attend to people once they're dead. But the basic concept remains the same. There's no reincarnation, really, generally speaking. And they don't even understand where this comes from. Judaism adopts it from sort of the Babylonian tradition, in turn influenced by Egyptian traditions. Christendom takes it off of Judaism. Islam takes it off of early Christianity. That's where these three branches, these three offshoots of the same sort of primordial quasi-paganism actually get these ideas. They're not purely biblical ideas. It's not purely Quranic in teaching. It's not purely driven by the Torah and sort of the early opinions of the Jewish people. It actually comes from paganism. That's where they get it, but they got it messed up. They didn't quite understand the metaphors that were involved. In some cases, there was no physical location, it was metaphoric. Like when Jesus talks about Gehenna. Again, I don't even believe that there was a Jesus, but the figure that people call Jesus talks about Gehenna. Whatever. It doesn't make any difference whether he lived or didn't. The other side is that some of these were physical, and they actually, in the modern time, most Christians especially, render it to the metaphysical. They say, well, yeah, heaven exists, but it's a spiritual place. It's not connected to the physical at all. And they make up a bunch of extra biblical opinions about why this is biblically acceptable. They use their own... It's weird because they use man's logic to enforce man's opinion while claiming a divine origin for it, even though it goes against the divine book that they claim to worship that had nothing to do with man penning it beyond putting the ink on paper. It's very funny. The Quran does the same thing. Muhammad did the same thing. The Jews did the same thing. They claim a divine inspiration for tales that largely they took from Babylon. And the Babylonians in turn claimed, yeah, these are inspired writings. They took them from Egypt. And the Egyptians claimed it was an inspired system. They probably got influenced heavily by whatever weird tribes built Göbekli Tepe and were wandering around building farms in Syria 9,500 years ago too. So it's not even, we don't even know exactly what the origin of human spirituality is. It's very difficult to trace all of these things back before, generally speaking, Egypt. Anything much before Egypt, kind of Samaria, and you're pretty lost when it comes to human spirituality. There are gaping holes in everything even then. We've got stuff from the Greek and Roman times where we've got allusions to some codex that existed 2,000 years ago with spiritual knowledge that we've never found a copy of. It's like extinct. The burning of the Library of Alexandria comes to mind, or something like that. By the way, every bibliophile just shuddered thinking about that. I shudder a little bit too. It's a great loss for humanity. So much lost material, so much lost lore and knowledge, and not knowledge necessarily objectively speaking, but human opinion on divine matters. I mean, including even up through the Renaissance or medieval period, even into the Enlightenment. You have all of these different works, all of these different opinions. Some of them are one of a kind. They get destroyed. We'll never get to read them again, unfortunately. And think of what a core of literature would be there for the occult world if that hadn't been the case. But yeah, the concept of ascendance and descent is a little bit confusing, or it can be. You've got to know a little bit about how these religions interacted with one another over time. Otherwise, if you take these stories literally, then you see vast contradictions. In reality, there's no real contradiction between the Abrahamic and the pagan systems, because the latter is borrowing so heavily, in many cases, from the former. And it's not just the case with the concept of an afterlife, or what is good, what is evil, what causes suffering, what causes virtue, what's paradise like, what's hell like, what's somewhere in between, and does it exist at all, and what's it like if it does. It's not just that. It goes into dietary laws. It goes into every law about life, descriptions of people. They rip off some of these, like the Bible even refers to a dead Babylonian king as Lucifer at one point. And most Christians don't acknowledge this because they've never read anything. They don't know the rudiments of Latin or Greek, nor do they know anybody in their congregation familiar with these languages. They've never bothered to go outside of their church or their sect and actually study these things. If they did, they'd realize there was a core of literature far more vast about every part of the Bible, much of it more inspired than what they're getting with some fire and brimstone preacher who only speaks one language, let's face it. That's about all. Peace out.